I'm so cold.
Man, am I excited for this. Today I'm going to be showing you how to build a full aftermarket hi-capa on an Airsoft Masterpiece base as I recreate my first full build with updated parts. 95% of this video is applicable to general hi-capa assembly and disassembly, and I will be making a separate recommended upgrade guide in the near future for those who are asking for it. Every part used in this video was provided by my sponsor, Airsoft, who used to be Limcat Customs. Same company, they just sell more than pistol parts now. Use my code at checkout if you want to help me out. And speaking of helping out, gotta thank my patron and channel members for their support, and god damn, there's a lot of you now. Thanks guys. Let's get into the build. Since this is an Airsoft Masterpiece build, the assembly of the frame is going to be a little different than the standard Marui style, and there are some part compatibility issues I'm going to get into later. But the long story short, if you bought an AM frame, make sure to use an AM hammer with the provided Sear or you're going to have a bad time. So starting with the frame, the fitment is pretty good with the empty slide, but we are going to have some fitment work to do later once the upper is completed. To access the chassis, you're going to slide out the two retaining pins in the side and then push the chassis assembly through the top of the frame. Using a Phillips head, unscrew the two halves of the chassis to reveal the Sear and valve knocker assembly, which will be pre-installed. Give the valve knocker channel a little sip of lube and then coat the Sear so it glistens like a cheese stick in the air fryer. The next step is to install the hammer into the chassis, but we haven't assembled that yet, so we're going to do it now. You're going to need the hammer itself, a strut, and the corresponding pin to hold them together. To complete the hammer assembly, ask for consent, and gently slide the strut into the hammer's ass with the bend facing the rear, using the provided pin to press it into place with pliers. I have evolved ever so slightly since my last build, so I'm now using a piece of material to prevent tooling marks on the hammer. Try and get the pin flush to the surface or close to it because it will rub inside the chassis and cause problems later. After completion, mesh the hammer with the Sear and close the chassis back up, promising you'll call it later. Make sure to check that the two halves of the chassis are flush before tightening it down, or you can warp it and send the build straight into the trash can. To complete the chassis, we need the firing pin and spring, which is sold separately because of course it is. You're going to drop the pin in the slot and struggle for several minutes as you attempt to install the spring underneath it with a small tool of your choosing. Make sure you keep a finger over this little piece of shit as you slide the chassis into the frame, or you will be staring at the carpet for a minimum of 23 minutes after it shoots across the room. Take the large retaining pin and slide it through the frame before grabbing your disconnector, which is also sold separately because why not, and slide it under the Sear to be locked in purgatory by the smaller retaining pin. At this point, you're probably going to flip the frame over to make sure that the pins are fully seated, which is actually the worst mistake you can make because the retaining pins will slide right back out and drop your disconnector. With the frame completed, we're going to move on to the grip assembly, starting with the hammer housing. This new grip from LA Airsoft is actually a manufacturing sample without anodizing because I wanted to polish it to match the overall look and the silver chrome finish wasn't available yet. The best feature of this grip is that it's fully Tokyo Marui compatible and will take any magwell or magazine release as opposed to the AM grips which do not. There's also going to be set screw adjustments in the front so you can actually tune your trigger without having to upgrade your trigger bar. Cool stuff. The slope of the grip has also been improved from the AM design so it feels much more comfortable in my hand, and there's also going to be a non-cutout version as well. I'm using the Cutout power regulator kit because it comes with a lot of pieces and I also like cows. In the bag you're going to get 2 end pieces, 2 springs, and a bunch of washers. I immediately yeet the silver spring because he is weak and brings shame to his family and we can't be having that. Load up the bottom piece with a bunch of washers followed by the spring and the top piece. I like to start with a high spring pressure rather than starting off weak and later losing my mind when the hammer malfunctions. Ideally, you want just enough pressure to overcome the magazine valve and cycle properly. Push the spring assembly up into the housing while you prepare to locate little piece of shit number 2. This guy holds the spring under pressure inside the housing and can only be obtained from a base gun or buying a completed housing assembly. Stick this dumb piece of engineering inside the little hole and squeeze the fuck out of him as you depress the spring assembly to lock him in place. If you do manage to lose this guy, it'll still be functional, but deep down in your heart of hearts, you know he's gone and he's never coming back, and you have to live with that. Just like my original build, I'm using the speed trigger, which has these cute little roller skates for reduced friction, the AM trigger bar, and pin. Don't lose that. The trigger bar will slide right into the trigger, and the pin will also slide right into the trigger, which is actually a problem. Make sure to super glue the pin or your trigger will fall off during use. Ask me how I know. After the glue is dry, slide the trigger into the grip and grab your magazine release. I'm using the LA Airsoft magazine release, which has an extended button for easier reloads. Drop the spring into the release, followed by whatever the hell this thing is called, and spend several minutes hurting your fingers before using a flathead to properly lock it in place. Double check that your trigger moves freely and hold it forward while you drop the release into the grip. Then, turn whatever the hell that thing was called with your flathead screwdriver to lock it in and attach the magazine release button with the provided screw. To attach the grip to the frame, I'm using these shiny AM screws because I just think they're neat. Lower the frame onto the grip and make sure it's fully seated before tightening down the screws. Next up, we have the rear and thumb safeties, which I could have attached to the frame earlier, but I didn't. Slot the rear safety into the back of the frame and drop your safety detents with the spring ass end out into the little hole on the side of the frame. Grab your side safeties and note that there is a male and female end that mesh together. Start with the right side safety, or not, you don't actually need it, and slot it through the frame and rear safety at a high angle. While holding it in place, begin to slot the left side safety at the same angle and prepare to fight for your life to complete this next step. You'll need a thin tool like this hex key to push the detent out of the way while you simultaneously attempt to press the side safeties together for a kiss at the same angle without messing up and launching the detent across the f***ing room. I've probably done this 100 times, so it looks easy, but it's not. Be careful. Double check that the safeties are functioning and we can move on to the sear spring. This is the Cow Trident sear spring, which will give you a really nice and light trigger pull compared to the stock Marui springs or AM springs, which are kinda chunky feeling. This little piggy controls the weight of pull for your trigger and also resets the disconnector. This little piggy peer pressures the sear to make sure it catches the hammer. And this little piggy engages the rear safety, which we don't care about. I like to feel a little more snap in my trigger brake and reset, so I bend the first piggy pretty far to apply more pressure. I also bend the second piggy a little bit to ensure my sear is going to snap into the hammer on time, but 99.9% of you won't need to do this unless your hammer won't lock back from wear. Here is the first little piggy in his natural habitat, and you can see how he interfaces with the trigger bar to control the weight and reset. Throw your rear safety and strut in the air like you just don't care, and slot the sear spring into the notch in the grip, making sure that the first and second piggy sit on top of the disconnector and sear like this. While holding the sear spring down, drop it like it's hot and slide the hammer housing into the grip, guiding the strut into the housing spring assembly and inserting the final retaining pin into the magwell. This is the LA Airsoft Guardian magwell, by the way. Now that the lower is completed, I give the hammer a sip followed by the disconnector and firing pin so they don't get jealous, before testing the trigger function. Now you might be saying to yourself, Eddie, you dumbass, that hammer is clearly functional and sounds amazing. You said there was going to be a problem. Well, the height at which your hammer sits inside the frame while locked back is dictated by the shape of the teeth on the sear and hammer as they mesh. This means that certain hammers and sears won't play nice with each other, as they will cause the hammer to sit too low, meaning the action of the slide won't be able to push the hammer down far enough to lock, or in my case, cause the hammer to sit too high, which adds friction, causing the slide to slow down or prevent return to battery like so.
Salsa, I need help!
Usually if the hammer sits too low, you can carefully file the sear to raise the hammer up into the proper position. But if the hammer is sitting too high, there is nothing you can do but replace the sear or hammer and hope they mesh better. Anyway, this is the new adjustable rear sight from LA Airsoft, which looks really nice and comes with a rocker bar if you're into that sort of thing. To install the rear sight, most of the time you can just slide it into the rear cutout on the slide. But AM slides are notoriously tight fitting in this area, so I had to ooga booga the sight end to make sure that the inside edges were flush to fit the blowback housing. This is also the LA Airsoft front sight, which is easily pushed into the slot and locked down with a hex screw. If you have a newer LA Airsoft slide, they actually have a recess for this screw to drop into, and I recommend super glue to prevent it from backing out. Before we can install the blowback unit, we need to assemble the nozzle. The LA Airsoft nozzle is my favorite, but they do not come with internals. You'll need the valve, valve spring, valve blocker, and the smallest man-made screw in existence. To install the internals, drop the valve and spring into the nozzle and slide in the valve blocker with the screw hole facing up to match the hole on the nozzle. Use your pinky to hold the blocker in place and use the smallest man-made Phillips head in existence to screw through the nozzle and into the blocker just till it's snug. Conduct a quick cavity search on your nozzle to double check that the valve is functioning, and we can move on to the blowback housing. This is the next speed blowback housing, which I actually had very high hopes for due to the multi O-ring cylinder head design, Delrin sheath, and Delrin ramp to reduce friction. However, this product is out of spec and I'll go into the problem it creates later. Ultimately, I switched to an Edge V2 blowback housing, but the installation is identical, so I'm not going to refilm it. Give the O-rings a little sip and make sure they're fully coated before sliding the nozzle in the housing using the guide on top. You'll also need a nozzle return spring, which makes the nozzle retract during action. I started with these Waldo Customs 130% springs, but eventually switched back to AIP 140s because these somehow both broke almost immediately, probably from being too short in the channel and lifting up past the guide. Drop the nozzle spring into the top of the housing with the coiled end facing the rear, and we can now slide the blowback housing into the slide. Make sure the legs of the blowback housing appear flush and use your blowback housing screw to lock it in place. Some rear sights like the one I'm using will also screw down into the blowback housing for a second support, so check for that as well. Once installed, pull back the nozzle and make sure it snaps back freely and easily. For the HopUp, I decided to stick with the TTI because it is hands down the best unit I've ever used, along with a 123mm 6.01 PDI barrel and LA Airsoft flat hop bucking, which I also use exclusively. To install the bucking, line up the inside patch with the cutout on the barrel and just squish it on. This HopUp is a one-piece design, meaning the barrel slides completely through the chamber instead of using a two-piece clamshell. Make sure the adjustment arm isn't blocking the chamber and give the bucking a little sip to make the install easier. You just need to push the barrel as far as you can into the chamber and then pull it through the rest of the way to fully seat the bucking. After that, the locking ring will slide over the barrel and prevent it from rotating. This is the LA Airsoft Hexcut outer barrel in the silver chrome finish. I definitely recommend picking up parts in the new chrome finishes when available, as they are a lot more durable and they provide a smoother action. Slide the innie into the outie and you'll notice that the notch on the HopUp rotates perfectly into the outer barrel. You can then slide the entire barrel assembly through the front of the slide and sit on the nozzle's face. For the recoil system, I'm using the Waldo Customs 120% ion spring, LA Airsoft short stroke kit, and the LA Airsoft Tornado guide rod, also in silver chrome. If you are short stroking, add a washer to the guide rod followed by your short stroke buffers, alternating a washer each time and making sure that a washer is on the end before dropping the spring and guide plug on top. The LA Airsoft guide plugs also come with a little Delrin ring inside to further reduce friction, by the way. Place the guide plug over the guide rod assembly and feel compelled to squish it 3 to 14 times because for some reason we just like to do that. You can then compress the spring and slot it into the slide like so to complete the upper assembly. Here I'm using the LA Airsoft threaded tracer adapter, which screws right into the outer barrel. Now that the upper is finished, we can attempt to fit it onto the frame, which now has significant friction due to the blowback housing sliding on the rails and adding pressure points to them. This is fairly standard with new builds, though I will say my last build with the LA Airsoft Hyperslide dropped right in and I didn't have to do any of the fitment work that we're about to get into. Generously waterboard the rails with lube and begin to stimulate the slide while offering words of encouragement. This process can take anywhere from minutes to hours, but make sure to take breaks to remove the excess metal shavings that will build up in between. Periodically check for rough spots of metal that appear and lightly file or use low grit sandpaper to sand them down and get the slide action smooth enough so that it can return to battery on its own. A test that I like to do is that if the slide can push itself past the disconnector, then it's probably good enough to test fire. Ideally, I do like my slides to be able to push themselves at least halfway off the frame. For my magazine setup, I use the Garter aluminum shells along with stock Tokyo Marui internals and the 9-ball purple gaskets for a more consistent gas output. I also forgot to mention that I'm using the AIP thumb rest slide stop, which I had to polish to be silver because silver was out of stock. Time to test fire. As you can see on the first chrono with 0.25 gram BBs, there's a lot of FPS variation due to the gap between the nozzle and the HopUp unit, which made for a lazy slide action as well. The hammer was also malfunctioning due to the Sear not playing nice, which caused trigger reset issues, half cocks, and later a broken nozzle as well. After taking way too long to figure out this problem, because why would this even be a problem, I swapped in a Masterpiece Edge V2 blowback housing with an edge nozzle, because that's what I had laying around, and a Masterpiece spur hammer, which completely resolved all the problems and made it run like a champ. I hope this video helped you guys, and keep an eye out for the recommended upgrade video coming soon. Thanks guys.